I want to talk with you a little bit more about the constitutional context, about the background of the Constitution. In the last video, I talked for a bit about problems of life in the new country under the Articles of Confederation. I have a slide here that rehearses some of those. I won't go back over them, but it's good to keep in mind that the current Constitution under which we operate is actually a response to an earlier governmental structure that had some defects. And keep that in mind as we go along. By the latter 1780s, many of the people who had led the Revolutionary War and were the leaders in the new nation realized that there were potential problems under the Articles of Confederation and decided to have a convention to try to deal with some of those problems. There was an attempt made to have such a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, in 1786. The group was not able to establish a quorum, so they decided to reassemble the next year in 1787 in Philadelphia. And that was a much more successful meeting. A much larger group of representatives from the state managed to convene, and by May 25th of 1787 they had a quorum and began the convention. Just by way of note, George Washington, the father of the country in the view of many, presided over the meetings. James Madison took notes, and there were a whole host of other famous characters that many of you have heard and read about over the years. A number of delegates actually left the convention once it became clear that one of the goals was to actually create a proposal for a new governmental form rather than simply to modify the Articles of Confederation. Modification of the Articles was the stated intention of the convention, but many of those who gathered and were in pivotal positions decided that there were too many problems with the Articles and it would be better to just start from scratch. So by the end of September of 1787, the new Constitution was actually drafted and ready to be sent to the states for approval. The drafters of the Constitution decided that each state would have to impanel a constitutional convention for the purpose of approving the Constitution. This way, the existing state legislatures could be bypassed and members of the public could be appealed to directly to consider the new governmental structure. There were going to be debates in each of the state as a result about the new Constitution, and in New York State there was going to be a particularly difficult debate. New York was one of the largest states. It had the most developed economy, and it had the most to lose in a governmental structure that ceded some power and authority to a central government. So in New York State, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay decided to draft a whole series of opinion pieces for a New York newspaper and publish them under the name of Publius. And this was an attempt to explain and defend the new constitutional proposal. And this is what comes to us as the Federalist Papers. Now, I have you read quite a number of the Federalist entries, and let me talk for just a second about a couple of pivotal ones. Number 9 and 10, particularly number 10, goes into detail. These two entries go into detail about the hazards of factions. These were written by James Madison, and in his opinion, and the opinion of many of the people at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, factions were the problem with both republics and democracies, and so we needed to develop some mechanisms for controlling factions. And in number 10, Madison says, well, we have this new science of politics, which has come up with a whole host of innovations in government that can give us some really terrific ideas about how we can organize a government to control factions. Factions, according to the founders, are bred in the nature of man. You can't, anytime you have human communities, you will have factions. We can't count on enlightened statesmen to solve the problems of governance, to be able to resolve factions. So therefore, we need to create a governmental structure that helps control the adverse results of factions. So the role of government for the founders was to protect individual rights and property from infringement by factions. And these could be majority factions or minority factions. And so the governmental structure that they set up is about controlling factions. But of course what this means is that very much of what happens in government comes down to a kind of warfare among factions. Now this makes a lot of modern Americans uncomfortable. We don't like the messiness of politics, of the tug and the push and pull of life among warring factions, but that's basically designed into the nature of our government. And of course, much that you see on the contemporary political landscape is a result of conflicts among factions. So whether you're looking, for example, at tax policy, or what we do with energy, or the huge problems of health care or Social Security, church and state, matters of the environment, all of these things, much of the disputation that takes place in our political system is between different viewpoints around these issues. So what these Federalist entries that I have you read argue is that it is possible to design a government that can both control factions and control itself. And the way you do that is you set up a separated powers system. And you'll see this in the subsequent Federalist entries as well as in the Constitution itself. So we have a legislature that is separate and distinct from an executive branch, which is headed by the president, which is in turn separate and distinct from a judicial branch of government. Each of these branches has a specific role, and if you set these separated and differentiated branches of government up correctly, according to the founders, then you can control both factions and you can control the government. You can keep the government from getting out of hand. So a couple of other interesting Federalist entries I have you read. Number 37 involves their argument about how the new Constitution promotes both energy and stability. Number 9 focuses on the Republican element of the new Constitution. The founders were profoundly suspicious of democracy. They looked around the world and saw the voters shifting dramatically and rapidly back and forth in their opinions, and they wanted to have a government that would not be so responsive to shifts in opinion that you could never have stability. So that's what they were trying to create in the setting. They believed that a Republican approach with democratically elected representatives was a better way to create a stable government than having something that approximated a more direct democracy. The other Federalist entries that I had you look at here were number 47, 48, and 51. 47 is about the separation of these branches of government. 48 is about controlling the legislative branch. The founders were particularly concerned that the legislature would run roughshod over the other two branches of government. To an extent, that happened for many decades under the Constitution, but in recent decades, particularly in the 20th century, the other branches of government have managed to reassert power and control. Number 51 is, along with number 10, probably the most famous of the Federalist entries. And I consider this to be sort of the quintessential statement on the separation of powers and how our government is supposed to control factions and control itself. Number 51 goes into some detail about the mixture of national and federal features in our governmental structure.